Vienna. The Ottoman Empire is at the gates. 200,000 soldiers. The largest military force the European continent has ever seen. And the city, Vienna, should fall in weeks. Maybe months. Everyone knows this. The walls are good. But not good enough. Not against this. There is a siege. 30 days. 40 days. The food in the city is gone. The water is running out. The defenders are exhausted. And on the morning of September 12th, something happens. Something that, on its surface, appears to be a failure. The Ottoman forces withdraw. Not defeated. Not crushed militarily. They simply leave. The reason they leave is this: the Ottoman army has supply lines. Long supply lines. They come from 3 months' march away from the heartland of Anatolia. And those supply lines are getting thin. The siege was supposed to end in weeks. It is now weeks. The supplies are running low. And the Ottoman commander, a man named Kara Mustafa Pasha, faces a choice. He can continue the siege. Maybe the city falls in another month. Maybe. But if the city does not fall, if the siege extends further, his army will starve. He will lose not the city, but his entire force. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers will die of hunger, not in battle. So he makes the logical choice. He withdraws. He organizes an orderly retreat. He keeps his army intact. He preserves his force for another campaign, another time. It is the right decision. And it is the decision that kills the Ottoman Empire. Not immediately. Not obviously. But from this moment forward, the trajectory is set. The Ottoman Empire, the civilization that has endured for 600 years, that at this moment controls territory from North Africa to the Arabian Peninsula to the Balkans to Anatolia, begins a slow, terminal decline. Within 200 years, it will be gone. And the question that historians spend lifetimes avoiding is this: how does a withdrawal from a failed siege in 1683 lead to the dissolution of an entire empire in 1922? What is the mechanism? What is the system that connects that one decision to that final collapse? Because it cannot be just military defeats. History is full of empires that lose wars and recover. It cannot be just economic problems. Empires survive economic crises. It cannot be just political dysfunction. Empires endure bureaucratic chaos. So what is it? This is the story of how one man's rational decision set off a chain of consequences that no one could stop. Of how empires, once they begin to decline, create their own momentum toward destruction. Of how the system that kept the empire alive for 6 centuries became the system that killed it. And of how we are still living in the consequences of that moment in 1683. Still paying the price for a decision made at a siege that nobody quite remembers. Chapter 1: The system that built 6 centuries. To understand the Ottoman collapse, you first have to understand the Ottoman success. Because the Ottoman Empire, at its peak, was not a brutal tyranny. It was not a simple military conquest that held power through fear. It was something far more sophisticated. It was a system. And that system is the reason the Ottoman Empire lasted 600 years when most empires last 2 centuries. The Ottoman system began in the 1300s in Anatolia with a small principality. A frontier kingdom, really. Nothing special. Just one group among dozens claiming territory and trying to survive. What made the Ottomans different was that they understood something about sustainability. They understood that empires do not collapse because of military defeat. Empires collapse because of internal fragmentation. An empire can survive external enemies. It cannot survive internal enemies. So the Ottomans built a system to prevent internal fragmentation. The system worked like this: the Sultan, the supreme ruler, owned everything. Every piece of land, every resource, every position of authority. Nothing belonged to anyone except the Sultan. This prevented the emergence of a hereditary nobility that could challenge the Sultan. In European feudalism, nobles owned land. They became powerful. They became independent. They could rebel. The Ottoman Sultan owned everything. He could remove any official from power. He could revoke any land grant. No one had hereditary security. So no one could build the power base to rebel. But the Sultan also understood that he could not rule through force alone. That is expensive. That is unstable. So the Sultan created a way to co-opt the best talent. He established a system called the Devshem. It worked like this: the Sultan's administrators would go into villages, primarily in the Balkans and Anatolia. They would take the most intelligent boys, usually between ages 10 and 15, from local families. The boys were removed from their families, converted to Islam, trained intensively in Ottoman law, Ottoman military science, Ottoman administration. And then they were integrated back into the empire as the highest officials. The Grand Vizier, the second most powerful person in the empire, was almost always a product of the Devshem system. The most senior military commanders were products of the Devshem. Now, understand what this accomplishes. First, it prevents the rise of a hereditary elite. You cannot pass power to your sons if your sons were taken as children and raised by the state. Second, it integrates the conquered populations. The local elites in conquered territories might resent Ottoman rule, but their sons are taken and made into Ottoman administrators. So they have incentive to cooperate. Third, it draws the most talented people from across the empire into the central government. The system does not rely on accident of birth. It selects for ability. So you have a system where the Sultan holds absolute power, but cannot be challenged because no one has the independent power base to challenge him. The empire is administered by the most talented people the empire can find, selected from across conquered territories. Local populations are integrated into the system, not excluded. Power flows from the Sultan downward, not upward from hereditary nobles. This is why the Ottoman Empire lasted 600 years. This is not a system built on conquest and force. This is a system built on integration and meritocracy within a structure of absolute power. It is actually quite sophisticated. And it worked brilliantly for 600 years. But systems, by their nature, are fragile. because systems depend on the people within them understanding and maintaining the system's logic. And the moment the people stop understanding that logic, the system begins to break. This is where the 1683 moment becomes significant. Because 1683 is not the moment the Ottoman system began to fail. 1683 is the moment when the people running the system stopped being able to maintain it. Chapter 2: The moment the system broke. In 1683, Kara Mustafa Pasha makes the decision to withdraw from Vienna. It is a rational decision. The siege is failing. The supply lines are thin. Retreat is the strategically sound choice. But here is what makes this moment different from every other Ottoman withdrawal in history. Kara Mustafa is not executing the decision on behalf of the Sultan. He is not carrying out orders from Istanbul. Kara Mustafa is making this decision because the Ottoman administrative system has broken down. The Sultan, at this moment, mourned for, is not in Vienna. He is not directing the campaign. He is not reviewing Kara Mustafa's options. The Sultan is in Istanbul, hundreds of miles away, disconnected. And more than that, the Sultan's ability to actually control the empire has been deteriorating for years. The Devshirme system that created the most talented administrators is still theoretically in place. But in practice, it has been replaced by something else. Something much worse. In the decades before 1683, the Ottoman bureaucracy has shifted. The highest positions, Grand Vizier, the top military commanders, the treasury officials, are no longer chosen based on merit through the Devshirme system. They are being chosen based on palace politics. Factions have emerged. Rival groups competing for the Sultan's favor. The Sultan is weak, mourned for, is known as an uninterested ruler, more concerned with hunting than governance. And into that weakness, factions have moved. Now, the empire is being run by whichever faction has the Sultan's personal favor at any given moment. Not by the most capable administrators. Not by people selected for merit. But by people who are good at court politics. And Kara Mustafa, despite withdrawing from Vienna, is seen by certain factions as a threat. A general with an army is always a threat to court politicians. So when Kara Mustafa returns from Vienna, when he returns to Istanbul, something happens. He is executed. Not for military failure, the withdrawal was strategically sound, everyone knew this. He is executed because the court factions that oppose his faction see an opportunity. A general returns with an army. The court fears that general will use the army to seize power. So they convince the Sultan to order the general's execution. Kara Mustafa is strangled in captivity. Now, let's understand what this means. In the previous 300 years of Ottoman history, a general who returned with an intact army was valuable. That general would be debriefed, integrated back into the system, maybe given a new command, maybe retired with honor. The general had status because he commanded resources. But in 1683, the court system has become so paranoid, so focused on internal power competition, that returning with an army is a death sentence. The message is clear: it is now more dangerous to be successful in defending the empire than to be unsuccessful. What happens next is predictable. The best generals learn this lesson. If you succeed too much, if you become too powerful, if you threaten the court, you die. So the best generals stop trying to succeed. They stop trying to create the conditions for victory. They play it safe. Military quality declines. New generals, coming up through the system, learn the same lesson. Do not become too powerful. Do not threaten the court. Do not win too decisively. So they do not. And the military becomes increasingly incompetent. But here is where it gets worse. Because this is not just about military leadership. This pattern spreads throughout the entire bureaucracy. The most capable administrators realize that being too successful, being too valuable, attracts attention and makes you a target for rival factions. So the most capable administrators start to protect themselves. They stop innovating. They stop solving problems. They maintain just enough competence to stay alive, but not enough to become indispensable and therefore threatening. And the empire's administrative machinery begins to rust. Decisions that should be made are not made. Problems that should be solved are left to fester. Reforms that should be implemented are delayed. This is the moment. This is 1683, and the years immediately after. The system that had kept the Ottoman Empire unified, effective, and dominant for 600 years breaks. Not because of external conquest. Not because of natural disaster. But because the internal system became so focused on power competition within the court that it stopped being able to maintain the basic functions of governance. The empire did not fall to an enemy at the gates. The empire began to eat itself. Chapter 3: The Slow Feedback Loop. So we have a system that is beginning to break. The court has become factional. The best administrators are learning not to succeed. The military is becoming risk-averse. The empire's decision-making is slowing. And this is where the feedback loop begins. A feedback loop is a system where the consequences of a problem create more of the problem. Here is how it works in the Ottoman context. The Ottoman Empire is surrounded by rivals. To the west, the rising European powers. To the north, Russia. To the east, Persia. To the south, the Arabian Peninsula. The empire is vast. But it is also exposed. To maintain control, the empire must continuously project power. It must conduct military campaigns. It must reinforce borders. It must demonstrate that it is still strong enough to control its territory. But the system is now broken. The military is incompetent. The administration is slow. The court is focused on internal power games. So campaigns begin to fail. Not catastrophically. Not yet. But they fail to achieve their objectives. The Ottomans try to push further into Europe. They get repelled. It is a shock. The Ottoman military, historically invincible, is now being pushed back. In response, the court tries to conduct another campaign. But because the administration is slow, because the military is risk-averse, because the best generals have learned not to be too successful, the next campaign is even more poorly prepared. So it fails worse. And here is the feedback loop. Every military failure means the empire loses territory. Every loss of territory means the empire has less land to tax. Less tax revenue means the empire has less money to pay the military. Less money means the military cannot be adequately equipped or trained. An inadequately equipped military is even more likely to lose the next battle, which means more territory is lost, which means less tax revenue, which means even less capacity for the military. This loop would not be catastrophic if it was slow. If the empire was slowly losing territory over 50 years, the empire could adapt. It could reduce the size of its military. It could consolidate its holdings. It could find new ways to generate revenue. But the system is broken at the level of decision-making. So the empire cannot adapt effectively. The court cannot agree on what should be done. Different factions want different things. So no coherent strategy is executed. The empire tries to defend everything equally. And in trying to defend everything, it defends nothing well. Territory keeps bleeding away. And the more territory is lost, the fewer resources the empire has to defend the remaining territory. So more territory is lost faster. The feedback loop accelerates. By 1700, 17 years after Vienna, the Ottoman Empire has already lost significant territory in the Balkans. By 1750, 67 years after Vienna, everyone who studies statecraft, everyone who reads the intelligence reports, everyone who understands how systems work, knows with near certainty that the Ottoman Empire is terminal. It will not recover. It cannot recover. The system has broken in a way that cannot be fixed because the people in the system do not know how to fix it. The court is still playing internal power games. The factions are still competing. But they are competing for pieces of a corpse. But here is the thing about dead systems. They do not die quickly. The Ottoman Empire, in 1750, is functionally dead. But it does not actually disappear until 1922. That is 172 years. For almost 2 centuries, the empire staggers forward, losing territory, losing power, but continuing to exist. Zombie empire. Moving but not alive. And during all those years, millions of people live and die within this dying system. Billions of decisions are made within this system. Countless wars are fought. Resources are spent. Lives are lost. All to delay something that is already decided. Chapter 4: The Empire That Could Not Die. From 1750 to 1922, the Ottoman Empire is in what historians called the Eastern Question. This is the formal name for a problem that European diplomats faced. What do we do about the Ottoman Empire? It is clearly dying. Everyone knows this. But it is not dead yet. And because it is not dead yet, because it still controls territory, because it still has an army, because it is still technically a sovereign power, it continues to exist. And its continued existence becomes a problem for the European powers. Because if the Ottoman Empire simply collapses, if it just disappears, then its territory becomes unclaimed. An unclaimed territory means that any European power can claim it. Which means war. Which means Europe will tear itself apart fighting over Ottoman land. So the European powers, despite the Ottoman Empire being weak, despite it being obviously dying, despite it being no longer a serious military threat, actually keep the Ottoman Empire alive. They prop it up. They loan it money. They broker agreements that prevent it from collapsing. They do this not out of kindness, but because a weak Ottoman Empire is better than the chaos of the empire's dissolution. A weak Ottoman Empire is known. It is predictable. It is something you can play diplomatic games with. But an Ottoman Empire that has completely collapsed, that has disappeared, leaving vacuum, that is chaos. So the Ottoman Empire becomes a managed decline. It is kept alive, barely, for 170 years, during which it loses the Balkans to Serbian, Bulgarian, Greek independence. It loses North Africa to French and British colonization. It loses territory in the Middle East to various powers. It loses economic independence to European banks and loans. It becomes the sick man of Europe, a term used by European diplomats to describe a dying empire that everyone is waiting to see finally expire. And here is what is important. During all these years, despite the empire being obviously in terminal decline, despite everyone knowing that the end is near, the empire continues to conduct itself as if it is still a major power. It maintains a large military. It tries to conduct diplomacy as an equal power. It makes grand declarations about recovering lost territories. All of this is theater. The empire cannot recover lost territories. It barely has the resources to maintain the territories it still holds. But it goes through the motions. And the Ottoman people, the Ottoman soldiers, the Ottoman administrators, they are living in a civilization that is dying. But they do not fully grasp how dying. They see the system continuing. So they assume the system will continue. Until, suddenly, it does not. The final collapse comes in 1922, after World War I. The Ottoman Empire has backed the wrong side. It fought for Germany and Austria. Germany and Austria lose. The Ottoman Empire, having backed the losing side, is dismantled. Turkey emerges from the ashes. The Ottoman Empire is gone. And almost no one is surprised. Because by 1922, the Ottoman Empire had been dead for 170 years. It was just taking a very, very long time for the corpse to stop moving. Chapter 5: Why it could not be fixed. This is the question that must be answered, because it is the question that allows us to see the system rather than just the history. Why could the Ottoman Empire not fix itself? It is not as if Ottoman administrators were stupid. It is not as if they did not understand that the empire was declining. There were reforms. There were people who understood the problem and tried to fix it. In the 1800s, there was a period called the Tanzimat. It was a deliberate reform program. The Ottoman government tried to modernize, tried to create a more efficient bureaucracy, tried to adopt European administrative practices. So why did the reforms not work? The answer is this: the system that was broken is the system that would have to implement the reforms. The court factions that had emerged in the 1700s, the system of internal power competition that had replaced meritocracy, that system could not be reformed. Because to reform the system, you would have to dismantle the factions. You would have to eliminate the internal power competition. You would have to create a unified, coherent decision-making structure. But the factions benefited from the current system. The people in power, the various court factions, had power because of the factional system. If you eliminated the factions, if you created a unified, meritocratic bureaucracy, then the factions would lose power. So the factions resisted reform. They would support certain reforms, certain limited changes that did not threaten their power. But they would never support the kinds of reforms that would require dismantling the factional system itself. This is a common pattern in systems that are dying. The system becomes broken. The people in the broken system understand, perhaps, that something is wrong. But the people in the broken system are invested in the brokenness. Their power, their position, their wealth, it all depends on the current arrangement. So they will fight to keep the system as is, even as the system slowly destroys everything. This is why the Ottoman Empire could not reform itself. Not because there were not smart people who understood what needed to be done, but because the people who had the power to implement reforms would have had to sacrifice their own power to do so. And people do not do that. Almost never. The Ottoman case is almost a perfect example of what happens when a system becomes so internally competitive, so focused on internal power struggles, that it loses the capacity to deal with external threats. The empire did not fall to a conquering enemy. It fell to internal paralysis. It fell because the people at the top were so focused on competing with each other for power that they could not unite to preserve the empire's power externally. In chess, there is a concept called Zugzwang. It means you are in a position where any move you make makes your position worse. You cannot improve your position. You can only make it worse. The Ottoman Empire, from roughly 1750 onward, was in Zugzwang. Any attempt to reform the system threatened the factions that held power. Any attempt to leave the system alone meant the empire continued to decline. There was no move that worked. Every option made things worse. So the empire stumbled forward, declining, unable to stop the decline, unable to reverse it, for 170 years. Chapter 6: The Shadow of 1683. Let's go back to 1683. Vienna. Kara Mustafa makes the decision to withdraw. From a military perspective, it is the right decision. The siege is failing. The supply lines are failing. Retreat preserves the army. But from a systemic perspective, it is the decision that begins the collapse. Not because the decision itself is wrong, but because the system is too fragile to absorb that decision and continue functioning. A stronger system would have absorbed the military setback, learned from it, adapted, and continued. But the Ottoman system, by 1683, had already become fragile. The factions were already emerging. The court was already becoming focused on internal power games. So the withdrawal from Vienna becomes an opportunity for the court factions to eliminate a successful general. Kara Mustafa is executed. And the message to the rest of the military is clear: success is dangerous. It attracts attention. It makes you a target. From that moment on, the military becomes risk-averse. It stops trying to win decisively. It stops trying to achieve ambitious victories. And an increasingly risk-averse military, facing increasingly capable enemies, begins to lose battles. Which means the empire loses territory. Which means the empire loses tax revenue. Which means the empire cannot afford the military anymore. Which means the military becomes even more risk-averse. The decision in 1683 sets all of this in motion. But the interesting thing is, it did not have to happen. In a slightly different version of history, Kara Mustafa returns from Vienna. The court trusts him, he is integrated back into the system, he is given command of the next campaign. And perhaps the Ottoman military loses that campaign, but the military is not fundamentally demoralized. It does not stop trying to win. And perhaps the empire continues to decline slowly, but it declines less quickly. It adapts better. It reforms earlier. And perhaps the Ottoman Empire survives into the 1900s in a more intact state. We cannot know this. But it is possible. The collapse was not inevitable. The trajectory was not predetermined. The collapse became inevitable after 1683. But not before. But here is where this story connects to something broader. Because 1683 is not unique. 1683 is an example of something that happens to many empires. An empire faces a challenge. The challenge is handled in a way that seems reasonable in the moment. But the way the challenge is handled reveals a weakness in the system. And the system, instead of fixing the weakness, allows the weakness to grow. And the weakness compounds. It creates feedback loops. It accelerates. And eventually, the empire collapses. The fall of the Ottoman Empire is not a story about one man making one decision. The fall of the Ottoman Empire is a story about a system that had worked brilliantly for 600 years, failing to adapt when the environment changed. The Devshirme system that selected the most talented administrators worked because it served the Sultan's interests. It prevented the rise of a hereditary nobility. But as the empire matured, as the threats became more sophisticated, as the empire had to deal with rivals that were also technologically and administratively sophisticated, the Devshirme system was no longer sufficient. The empire needed to evolve. It needed to create new mechanisms of talent selection. It needed to become more innovative. It needed to become more adaptive. But instead, the empire tried to preserve the old system. And in doing so, it created the conditions for internal factionalism. And internal factionalism destroyed the empire's capacity to adapt. So the empire declined. Epilogue: the decision we are still making. The Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1922. The sick man of Europe finally died. But before it died, it had been dying for almost 200 years. And during all those years, millions of people lived in a civilization that they were told was eternal. That was told to be strong. That was told to be the guardian of a great tradition. All the while, the civilization was hollowing out. The system was breaking. The center could not hold. And here is what we need to understand, because this is not ancient history. This is not something that happened so long ago that it has no relevance to the present. Because we are living in a world shaped by the Ottoman collapse. The Ottoman Empire controlled the Middle East for 600 years. When it collapsed, new powers moved in. The British, the French, the Americans. They drew borders that made sense for them, not for the populations that lived there. They created the modern Middle East. And the modern Middle East, shaped by the collapse of the Ottomans, has never been stable. Because the borders do not match the populations. Because the systems of government were imposed from outside, not evolved from within. Because the region was never allowed to find its own path. So we are living with the consequences of 1683. We are living in a world shaped by an empire that could not adapt. We are living in a world shaped by a system that broke and could not fix itself. But there is something else. There is something that connects the Ottoman collapse to the Britain story we told in episode 1. Because Britain, while the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, was rising. Britain was adapting. Britain was innovating. Britain was building new systems of financial dominance. While the Ottoman Empire was trying to preserve the old, Britain was inventing the new. And because Britain was inventing, because Britain was adapting, because Britain was building new mechanisms of power, Britain became dominant. Not because Britain was inherently superior, but because Britain's system was adaptive. The Ottoman system was rigid. Rigidity leads to collapse. Adaptation leads to dominance. And here is the final question, the one that matters for understanding the world we live in now. When do our systems become rigid? When do our mechanisms of power become so focused on internal competition that they lose the capacity to adapt to external threats? When do we become the Ottoman Empire, stumbling forward in decline, unable to fix what is broken, unable to imagine another way? The Ottoman administrators did not know they were building a system that would collapse. They thought they were governing wisely, making rational decisions. And in the moment, they were making rational decisions. The problem is that rational decisions in a broken system do not prevent collapse. They accelerate it. This is not a story about the past. This is a warning. It is a pattern. It is a template for how civilizations die. Not from conquest, from rigidity, from internal competition that prevents adaptation, from people in power who will do anything to preserve their power, even if it means destroying what they claim to be protecting. The Ottoman Empire lasted 600 years. It took another 170 years to die. We are watching systems that have lasted merely 200 years. The question is not, will our systems collapse? The question is, when they begin to collapse, will we be able to see it? Will we be able to stop it? Or will we, like the Ottomans, stumble forward, blind, until the end arrives?